You don't realize how desperate you are until you're standing in front of a help wanted sign, squinting at the fine print like it's the answer to all your problems. That was me, 34, unemployed, and running out of excuses to tell my landlord. The ad was taped to the window of a dingy-looking office downtown, the kind of place where you'd expect to find temp jobs or tax services, not a career-defining opportunity. It read, "Overnight security guard needed. No experience necessary. Must follow all rules without exception. Call for interview." I stood there for longer than I'd care to admit, debating if it was worth the effort. I didn't have any real options left. Bills were piling up, my fridge held only condiments and half a loaf of stale bread, and I was 1 week away from eviction. If they were willing to hire someone with no experience, I figured I might as well give it a shot. The office smelled like old coffee and copier toner. The receptionist, a wiry guy with glasses perched too far down his nose, handed me a clipboard with a single-page application. It was the most basic form I'd ever seen: name, address, phone number. No questions about skills or work history, no background check. Just enough space for them to know you existed. I filled it out and handed it back, expecting at least a cursory interview. Instead, he glanced at the page, nodded, and told me to show up at 8 p.m. sharp that night. I should have been suspicious right then and there. No one hires that fast unless the job is either too terrible or too dangerous for anyone else to take. But I was too broke to think twice. That night, I showed up at an old industrial building on the edge of town. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Cracked windows, rusted metal siding, a few faint signs warning trespassers to stay out. A single light flickered above the entrance, casting long, uneven shadows across the cracked pavement. I hesitated, clutching the strap of my backpack. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a small, dimly lit lobby. A man stood behind a desk, his face hidden beneath the brim of a security cap. He looked up as I entered, gave me a curt nod, and motioned for me to approach. "You're the new guy?" he asked. His voice was gruff, like he'd spent decades yelling over heavy machinery. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound confident. "I guess I am." He handed me a laminated sheet of paper. "Read this. Memorize it. Don't deviate." I glanced down at the paper. It was a list of rules, specific, oddly detailed, and entirely unlike anything I'd expected. 1. Clock in at exactly 8 p.m., not a minute earlier or later. 2. Do not leave the main security room between 12 a.m. and 12:15 a.m. 3. If you hear knocking at the west entrance, do not answer. 4. Under no circumstances should you look at the monitors in the lower right corner. 5. If you hear the emergency alarm, follow the red arrows. Do not stop until you reach the safe room. 6. At 3:33 a.m., turn off all lights for exactly 1 minute. Do not turn them back on early. 7. At the end of your shift, exit the building immediately. Do not speak to anyone on your way out. I looked up, confused. Is this some kind of joke? The man's expression didn't change. "Those are the rules. Follow them and you'll be fine. Break them and..." He stopped, his lips tightening into a grim line. "Well, just don't break them." The security room was cramped but functional. A desk with an array of monitors, a couple of old chairs, and a coffee machine that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration. The screens displayed grainy black and white footage of various parts of the building. Empty hallways, storage rooms, and a parking lot so overgrown it was barely recognizable. I settled into the chair and watched the clock tick toward 8 o'clock. When the second hand aligned perfectly, I punched in. The moment I did, the monitor in the lower right corner flickered to life, showing static. I remembered the rule and immediately looked away, my pulse quickening. What would happen if I broke that rule? Would I get fired? Was it just a prank to haze the new guy? First, nothing happened. The building was eerily silent, the only sounds coming from the hum of the monitors and the occasional creak of old pipes. By 11:55 p.m., I was almost bored enough to convince myself this was all a waste of time. Then the west entrance camera flickered. I leaned forward, staring at the screen as the image steadied. Someone or something was standing outside the door, their silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My heart jumped. They knocked once. I froze. The rules echoed in my mind. Do not answer. The knock came again, louder this time. My instincts screamed at me to grab the radio, call for help, do something. But I stayed put, gripping the edge of the desk as the knocking grew more insistent. It stopped suddenly, leaving the air thick with silence. I didn't breathe again until the figure disappeared from the screen. The silence after the knocking was almost worse than the sound itself. I stayed glued to my seat, my eyes darting between the monitors, waiting for something else to happen. My hands trembled as I adjusted the volume on the radio clipped to my belt, half expecting it to burst to life with static or a voice calling my name. But nothing came. It wasn't until a few minutes later that I realized how tightly I was gripping the desk. My knuckles were white, and my palms felt damp. I forced myself to let go and leaned back in the chair, trying to shake off the tension. It's just a prank, I muttered under my breath, though I didn't really believe it. Maybe the other guards were testing me, seeing if I'd follow their bizarre rules or freak out on my first night. But when I glanced at the west entrance monitor again, the hallway was empty. Whoever or whatever had been there was gone. I checked the clock. 11:59 p.m. Suddenly, Rule 2 sprang to mind. Do not leave the main security room between 12 a.m. and 12:15 a.m. I didn't know what would happen if I broke the rule, and I didn't want to find out. I stayed put, my gaze flickering nervously between the monitors. The minutes crawled by, each second marked by the soft, rhythmic ticking of the wall clock behind me. Then, at precisely midnight, the building seemed to shift. It started as a faint vibration beneath my feet, like someone was moving something heavy on the floor above me. Then came the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud in the otherwise silent building. They echoed through the halls, growing louder as they approached. I checked the monitors, flipping through the different camera feeds. Every hallway was empty, but the sound persisted, as if something unseen was moving closer. My breath caught in my throat. I gripped the arms of my chair, forcing myself to stay still. The rules. Don't leave the room. The footsteps stopped abruptly at the door to the security room. I stared at the grainy feed of the hallway outside, my pulse racing. The door handle rattled, but it didn't turn. Whatever was out there wasn't coming in, at least not yet. The next 15 minutes felt like hours. I didn't move. I barely even blinked. When the clock finally struck 12:15 a.m., the building seemed to exhale. The vibration stopped, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The rest of the night was uneventful, at least until I noticed something strange on one of the monitors. It was just past 3:30 a.m., and I was starting to feel the effects of exhaustion. My eyelids were heavy, and my head bobbed forward every few minutes. I had almost convinced myself that the earlier events were just my imagination running wild. But then the lower right monitor, static-filled since the start of my shift, suddenly cleared. I shouldn't have looked. The image on the screen was blurry at first, but as it came into focus, I felt a cold chill run down my spine. It wasn't an empty hallway or an office like the other feeds. It was somewhere else. A dark room, lit only by a faint, flickering light. The walls were covered in strange symbols, circles, triangles, and jagged lines that seemed to shift when I looked directly at them. In the center of the room stood a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on the camera. The longer I stared, the harder it became to look away, as if the screen itself was drawing me in. A sudden noise broke the spell. A loud, sharp bang from somewhere in the building. I jumped, my chair scraping against the floor as I tore my eyes away from the monitor. My heart raced as I glanced at the clock. 3:33 a.m. The lights. The rule. Turn off all lights for exactly 1 minute. I scrambled to hit the switch, plunging the room into darkness. The glow of the monitors was the only source of light now, casting eerie shadows across the walls. I counted the seconds in my head, each one stretching longer than the last. When I reached 60, I flipped the lights back on. The room looked the same, but I felt different, shaken, exposed. I glanced at the lower right monitor, half expecting to see that same dark room, but it had returned to static. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted. The sunlight creeping through the edges of the security room's blinds felt like a lifeline, pulling me out of the surreal nightmare of the night. I grabbed my backpack and headed for the exit, moving as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. As I reached the door, I heard a voice behind me. "How'd your first night go?" I turned to see the man from the night before, the one who'd given me the list of rules. His expression was unreadable, but there was a glint of something in his eyes. Curiosity, maybe, or something darker. "It was fine," I said, my voice hoarse. "Quiet." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me. "Good. Keep it that way." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. All I wanted was to go home, collapse into bed, and pretend this place didn't exist. But as I stepped outside, a thought struck me. This was only the first night. What else was waiting for me in the dark? The next night, I returned to the facility with a gnawing sense of dread. All day, I tried to convince myself that the strange occurrences from the night before had just been tricks of my mind. A combination of exhaustion, paranoia, and the eerie silence of the building. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something was off about this place, and the rules weren't just arbitrary nonsense. When I arrived, the man from the night before was waiting for me. He handed me the same laminated sheet of rules, as if I hadn't already memorized every word. "Don't get cocky," he said, his tone sharp. "It's easy to think you can cut corners after a while, but the rules exist for a reason." I nodded, swallowing the urge to ask him what exactly that reason was. The look on his face told me I wouldn't like the answer. The first few hours of my shift passed uneventfully. The monitors showed nothing but empty hallways and dusty rooms, and I busied myself with a crossword puzzle I'd brought from home. Every now and then, I glanced at the lower right monitor, its static and ominous reminder of what I'd seen the night before. By 11:30 p.m., I was starting to relax. Maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe tonight would be easier. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, the familiar tension crept back in. I checked the rule sheet again, as if the words might have changed since I last read them. 2. Do not leave the main security room between 12 a.m. and 12:15 a.m. I made sure my chair was firmly planted in the middle of the room and resolved to stay put, no matter what. At exactly midnight, the vibrations started again. This time, they were stronger, rattling the desk and the monitors. The footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, echoing through the halls like they were meant to be heard. I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay calm. Then, something different happened. A voice called out, faint but unmistakable. "Hello? Is anyone there?" My stomach dropped. It sounded like a woman, her tone laced with fear. I leaned closer to the monitors, flipping through the camera feeds. In one of the hallways, just outside the west entrance, I saw her. A young woman in a tattered dress, her hair matted and her face pale. She looked directly at the camera, her eyes wide with panic. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm lost. I need help." My instincts screamed at me to do something. But then I remembered Rule 2. Do not leave the main security room between 12 a.m. and 12:15 a.m. I hesitated, my mind racing. What if she was real? What if she needed help? Could I really just sit here and do nothing? Another knock came, loud and urgent, from the west entrance. Her knock. "Please," she said again, louder this time. "I know someone's in there." I stood up, my heart pounding. The rule didn't make sense. How could I just ignore her? I stepped toward the door, but something stopped me. An overwhelming sense of wrongness that I couldn't explain. It wasn't just fear. It was a primal, gut-deep certainty that leaving the room would be a mistake. The knocking stopped abruptly. I turned back to the monitors, but the woman was gone. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the memory of the woman lingered. I couldn't stop thinking about her, wondering if I'd made the right choice. By the time 3:33 a.m. rolled around, I was so distracted that I almost forgot to turn off the lights. When I flipped the switch, I counted the seconds carefully, my eyes fixed on the clock. At 58 seconds, I couldn't resist glancing at the monitors. That's when I made my second mistake. The lower right monitor was clear again, showing the same dark room I'd seen the night before. But this time it was empty. No symbols on the walls, no flickering light, just a single chair in the center of the room, facing the camera. I stared at it, transfixed, until a sound behind me made me jump. A faint whisper. I whipped around, but the room was empty. The lights came back on automatically, and the monitor returned to static. My heart raced as I tried to catch my breath. Something was wrong, more wrong than usual. And then I realized what I'd done. I'd broken a rule. I waited for something to happen, some punishment or consequence. But the hours passed, and nothing came. By the time my shift ended, I was convinced I'd gotten away with it. The next night, I arrived at the facility feeling uneasy. The man at the desk wasn't there, and the security room was empty. I checked the monitors, but everything seemed normal. No strange figures, no mysterious women. I settled into my chair, trying to shake the sense of foreboding. But as the hours ticked by, I noticed something strange. The static on the lower right monitor was gone. Instead, it showed a live feed of the hallway outside the security room. At first, I thought it was just a glitch. But then, at exactly midnight, the camera feed changed. It was the same dark room as before, only now there was something new. The chair was occupied. It was me. The figure on the screen was identical to me. Same clothes, same posture, even the same nervous twitch in my hands. My doppelganger stared directly at the camera, unblinking. I turned away, my pulse racing. When I looked back, the screen was blank. The rest of the night was a blur of paranoia and fear. By the time my shift ended, I was questioning my sanity. But one thing was clear. Breaking the rules had consequences, and they weren't over yet. When I arrived for my third night at the facility, I wasn't sure what I was walking into. The events of the previous night had left me shaken, but I couldn't afford to quit, not with rent due and my savings already drained. The rules might have seemed ridiculous at first, but now they felt like a lifeline. A thin thread keeping me from falling into something I couldn't understand. This time, the man who had handed me the rules wasn't at the front desk. Instead, I was greeted by someone else. A woman older with sharp eyes that seemed to dissect me as I walked through the door. "You're the new one," she said, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. She leaned against the desk, her arms crossed, as if sizing me up. "How are you holding up?" I hesitated. "It's been interesting." She smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Yeah, that's one word for it." She extended a hand. "Name's Marlene. Been here 10 years. 10 years? I asked, incredulous. "Why would anyone stay that long?" "Benefits are good," she said, shrugging. "And some of us don't have a choice." Marlene led me to the security room, explaining as we walked. "They like to rotate us around. Keeps things balanced or whatever. You'll meet the others eventually, but for now, it's just you and me." I wasn't sure what she meant by balanced, but I didn't press her. The building felt different tonight, heavier somehow. The air seemed thicker, the shadows darker. As we entered the security room, Marlene gestured toward the monitors. "You've probably figured out most of it by now. Stick to the rules, don't ask too many questions, and you'll do fine." I frowned. "What happens if you break a rule?" Her expression darkened. "You don't want to find out." I thought of the doppelganger I'd seen on the monitor and decided not to push the topic. Instead, I asked, "What about the others? The guards?" Marlene's lips tightened. "We don't talk much. Everyone has their own way of dealing with this place. You'll see." She didn't elaborate. Instead, she handed me a fresh list of rules, identical to the one I'd been given on my first night, and left without another word. It wasn't until later in the night, around 1 a.m., that I met Alex. He was a wiry guy in his late 20s, with messy hair and a perpetual air of exhaustion. He poked his head into the security room, startling me. "Hey," he said, "you must be the new guy." I nodded, trying to mask my unease. "Yeah, I'm Jake." "Alex," he said, stepping inside. "How are you finding it so far?" "Weird as hell, right?" "That's one way to put it," I said, watching as he plopped down in the spare chair. Alex laughed, but it was a hollow sound. "Yeah, I had the same reaction my first week. Thought it was some kind of elaborate prank. Then I broke Rule 6. I stiffened. "What happened?" His smile faded. "It's not about what happened to me. It's what didn't happen to everyone else." Before I could ask what he meant, he changed the subject. "Look, I get it. You're new, and none of this makes sense. But trust me, follow the rules no matter how stupid they seem. And if Marlene offers you advice, take it. She's been here longer than any of us." "Why does she stay?" I asked. Alex shrugged. "Same reason we all do, I guess. Some people get out, but most don't. It's like this place. Keeps you." His voice dropped. "You'll see." The rest of the night was a mix of tension and monotony. Alex stayed for a while, chatting about nothing in particular, but he left before 3 a.m., muttering something about not wanting to be in the room when it was time to turn off the lights. When 3:33 a.m. rolled around, I braced myself for another unsettling experience. I hit the light switch and counted, my heart racing as the seconds dragged by. This time, I kept my eyes fixed on the clock, refusing to glance at the monitors. At 59 seconds, I heard it again, a faint whisper, just behind me. The urge to turn around was overwhelming, but I stayed put, gripping the desk until the lights flickered back on. The room was empty. The monitors were static. I exhaled, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Toward the end of my shift, as the first rays of sunlight began to creep through the blinds, Marlene returned. She leaned against the doorframe, watching me with that same piercing gaze. "Anything unusual tonight?" she asked. I shook my head, not wanting to admit how close I'd come to breaking another rule. She nodded, as if that was the answer she'd expected. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Rule 7. It's the most important one." I frowned, confused. "Why?" "Just trust me," she said. "Whatever happens, when your shift ends, you leave. You don't stop, you don't talk to anyone, and you don't look back." Her tone was serious, almost desperate. I thought of the doppelganger I'd seen on the monitor and the whispers in the dark. My skin prickled. "I'll keep that in mind," I said. "Good," she replied, "because some people forget, and when they do, they don't come back." With that, she left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway. I sat there for a long time, staring at the clock and waiting for my shift to end. When 8 a.m. arrived, I grabbed my bag and bolted for the exit, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't stop, I didn't look back, and I didn't say a word to the figure I thought I saw standing in the shadows by the door. By the time I arrived for my 4th night, the fear had begun to morph into something else. Curiosity. Every nerve in my body told me to stick to the rules, to do my job, and to leave without asking questions. But the events of the past nights, the knocking, the doppelganger, the whispers, were eating away at me. What was this place? Why the rules? What happened to people who didn't follow them? I wasn't ready to test the rules again, not after the consequences of glancing at the monitor, but I needed answers. And if no one was going to give them to me, I'd find them myself. The shift started quietly enough. Marlene wasn't there when I arrived, but Alex popped in around midnight. He gave me a casual wave and settled into the chair opposite mine, chatting about a new horror movie he'd watched the night before. His nonchalance was jarring, considering the circumstances. "How are you so calm?" I asked, cutting him off mid-sentence. He raised an eyebrow. "Calm?" "Yeah," I said, gesturing at the monitors. "This place, the rules, none of it freaks you out." "Oh, it freaks me out," he admitted. "I just don't let it show. Trust me, if you stick around long enough, you'll get used to it." I doubted that, but before I could press him further, he checked his watch and stood up. Gotta make my rounds, he said. See you later. As soon as he was gone, the curiosity I'd been trying to suppress came rushing back. I glanced at the laminated rule sheet lying on the desk, my fingers drumming against the edge of the table. 2. Do not leave the main security room between 12 a.m. and 12:15 a.m. That rule had kept me rooted to my chair every night so far. But now it was 12:20, and I couldn't stop thinking about the hallways, the endless, empty corridors I'd only ever seen through the monitors. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the room. The air in the hallway was colder than I'd expected, and the sound of my own footsteps echoed unnervingly against the concrete walls. I stuck close to the security room at first, shining my flashlight into the nearest corners. Everything looked normal: dusty floors, peeling paint, and an unsettling number of locked doors. I ventured further, my nerves on edge. As I walked, I noticed subtle changes in the atmosphere. The air felt heavier, like the building itself was pressing down on me. The walls seemed narrower, the shadows darker. Then I found it, a door that wasn't locked. It was labeled Storage Room C in faded letters, and the doorknob was covered in grime. I hesitated, the rule sheet flashing in my mind. Nowhere did it explicitly forbid exploring the facility, but something about this felt wrong. Still, I couldn't resist. I twisted the knob and stepped inside. The room was small and cluttered, filled with old filing cabinets and dusty shelves. My flashlight beam swept across the space, revealing boxes labeled with strange symbols and stacks of papers so old their edges had yellowed. On one of the shelves, I found a stack of binders. The covers were unmarked, but when I opened the first one, I saw pages of typed reports. The language in the reports was clinical, almost detached, but the content was anything but. Each one described an incident in the building, accompanied by dates and times. My stomach churned as I read. Incident number 47. Subject failed to adhere to Rule 6. Unexplained auditory phenomena detected at 3:37 a.m. Subject unresponsive at end of shift. Presumed lost. Incident number 73. Unauthorized entry into Storage Room A. Visual anomalies reported. Subject terminated. Incident number 89. Emergency alarm activated without cause. Entity sighting reported near west entrance. Subject accounted for but exhibiting unusual behavior. There were dozens of entries like this, each one more unsettling than the last. Some incidents referenced entities, while others mentioned dimensional interference and time discrepancies. One report described a guard who had seen himself walking down a hallway, only for the doppelganger to vanish moments later. I closed the binder, my hands shaking. Whatever this place was, it wasn't just an ordinary facility. It felt like a trap, a labyrinth where the rules were the only thing keeping the chaos at bay. As I stepped back into the hallway, I felt the shift immediately. The air was colder now, and the silence was heavier, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I shined my flashlight down the corridor and froze. A shadow moved at the far end. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its shape was amorphous, shifting like smoke, but its presence was undeniable. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The shadow didn't move toward me, but I could feel it watching. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing wildly as I bolted back toward the security room. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door shut behind me. When Marlene arrived at the end of my shift, I could barely look her in the eye. She seemed to notice immediately. "You look like hell," she said, dropping into the chair beside me. "Something happened?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "No, just tired." She studied me for a long moment, her sharp eyes narrowing. "Listen," she said finally, her tone serious. "I get it. This place messes with your head. Makes you want to figure it out, break the rules, see what's behind the curtain. But trust me, it's not worth it." I nodded, but the guilt gnawed at me. I didn't tell her about the reports or the shadow. I didn't tell her that I'd already broken the rules again, that I'd opened a door I wasn't supposed to. As I left the building that morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The shadow in the hallway, the strange reports, it all felt like a warning. And I had the sinking suspicion that I was running out of chances to heed it. By the time I arrived for my 5th night, I'd convinced myself that I could keep my head down, follow the rules, and survive. But the moment I stepped into the building, I knew that wasn't going to happen. The air felt different, heavier, almost suffocating. The lights in the lobby flickered as I entered, and for the first time, I noticed the faint hum that seemed to emanate from the walls, like the building itself was alive. I shook off the unease, clocked in exactly on time, and headed to the security room. Marlene was already there, leaning against the desk with her arms crossed. Her usual sharp demeanor was absent, replaced by something I'd never seen before: genuine concern. "We've got a problem," she said. Marlene handed me a revised list of rules. My stomach dropped as I scanned the page. 8. If you encounter the rule enforcer, do exactly as it says. Do not argue. Do not hesitate. I looked up at her, confused. What's a rule enforcer? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she grabbed the chair opposite mine and sat down, her gaze fixed on the monitors. "It doesn't show up often. I've only seen it twice in 10 years. But when it does..." She trailed off, her jaw tightening. "What does it look like?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "You'll know," she said simply. "Trust me, you'll know." I wanted to press her for more details, but before I could, she stood up. "Just stick to the rules tonight," she said, her tone unusually soft. "And remember Rule 8. The first few hours of my shift passed uneventfully, but the tension in the air was palpable. The monitors showed nothing unusual, just empty hallways and storage rooms, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At 11:45 p.m., I heard the first sign of trouble. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails against glass. It came from the west entrance, the same place I'd seen the mysterious woman days before. My pulse quickened as I switched the monitor to that hallway. The screen flickered, and for a moment I thought it had gone to static. But then I saw it. A figure standing just outside the door. Its body was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated like a grotesque shadow puppet. Its face, or what passed for a face, was featureless, a smooth expanse of pale, almost translucent skin. The tapping continued, louder now. My instincts screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. I was frozen. My gaze locked on the screen as the figure slowly raised one impossibly long arm and pointed directly at the camera. The tapping stopped. The next few minutes were a blur. I tried to focus on the rules, repeating them in my head like a mantra. But when the clock struck midnight, everything changed. The static on the lower right monitor cleared. At first, I thought it was the dark room again, but this time the image was different. It showed the hallway outside the security room, and standing in the center of the frame was the figure from the west entrance. The rule enforcer. It didn't move. It simply stood there, its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as if waiting for something. My stomach churned as I glanced at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But the figure didn't come inside. Instead, the radio on my desk crackled to life. "Open the door." The voice was low and distorted, like a tape recording played at half speed. I stared at the radio, my hands trembling. Rule 8 echoed in my mind. Do exactly as it says. Do not argue. Do not hesitate. Swallowing hard, I stood up and approached the door. My fingers fumbled with the lock as I turned the handle and pulled it open. The hallway was empty. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined the whole thing. But then the radio crackled again. "Follow." I stepped into the hallway, my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows against the walls. The air was colder out here, and every step felt like walking through water. The rule enforcer was nowhere to be seen, but I could feel its presence, an oppressive weight pressing down on me. The radio buzzed. "Turn left." I obeyed, my legs moving on autopilot. The hallway stretched on longer than I remembered, the dim overhead lights flickering as I walked. I reached a corner and turned left, as instructed. "Stop!" I froze. Ahead of me, the hallway ended in a door I hadn't seen before. It was different from the others, sleek and metallic, with no handle or visible hinges. Symbols were etched into its surface, similar to the ones I'd seen in the reports from Storage Room C. The radio crackled one final time. "Do not open." I stared at the door, my heart pounding. Something about it drew me in, like a magnet pulling at the edges of my consciousness. My hand twitched, almost involuntarily, as if reaching for the door might somehow reveal all the answers I'd been searching for. But the rules. Do not argue. Do not hesitate. I stepped back, my breath shallow and uneven. The hallway seemed to shift around me, the walls rippling like the surface of a disturbed pond. And then, without warning, the metallic door vanished. When I returned to the security room, the rule enforcer was waiting for me. It stood in the corner, its elongated form hunched over, its featureless face turned toward the monitors. It didn't acknowledge me as I entered, didn't move or make a sound. It simply existed, an impossible presence that defied explanation. I sat down at the desk, my eyes darting between the rule enforcer and the clock. The rest of the shift passed in tense silence, and when 8 a.m. finally arrived, the figure was gone. As I left the building, Marlene was waiting for me in the parking lot. Her expression was grim. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. I nodded, my throat dry. "What is it?" She shook her head. "No one knows, but it keeps the rules in place. And as long as it's watching, so should you." The weight of what I'd seen the night before stayed with me as I walked into the building for my 6th shift. My mind replayed the rule enforcer's distorted commands and the metallic door etched with symbols. Each time, the questions grew louder in my head. What was behind that door? Why did the rules matter so much? And why did the rule enforcer choose me? The answers felt maddeningly close, just beyond reach. Marlene's warning lingered. It keeps the rules in place. And as long as it's watching, so should you. But part of me couldn't let it go. The urge to find out more was growing too strong to ignore. That night, I arrived early and found the security room empty. Alex was usually hanging around before his rounds, but there was no sign of him. On the desk, I noticed something new. A folded piece of paper that hadn't been there before. I opened it cautiously, my pulse quickening as I realized what it was. A crude map of the facility. It was hand-drawn, the lines shaky and uneven, but it marked areas I'd never seen before. Rooms and hallways that didn't show up on the monitors. At the bottom of the map was a single word, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Beware." I stared at the map, my mind racing. Who had left it? Was it a warning? An invitation? I hesitated, then tucked the paper into my pocket. If the map was real, it could be my chance to finally understand this place. At midnight, I broke Rule 2 for the 2nd time. Leaving the security room felt like stepping into another world. The hallways were darker tonight, the overhead lights barely casting enough illumination to see. I followed the map carefully, moving deeper into the facility than I ever had before. The first few turns led me past familiar sights, storage rooms, empty offices, and dead-end hallways. But as I ventured further, the building began to change. The walls were no longer the dull gray concrete I'd come to expect. Instead, they were covered in faint, intricate carvings, like the symbols I'd seen on the metallic door. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating in my chest. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, clutching the map like a lifeline. The map led me to an unmarked hallway that stretched longer than any I'd seen before. The air was colder here, almost icy, and the carvings on the walls glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. At the end of the hallway was a door, not the metallic door from the night before. This one was wooden, old and weathered, with a brass handle that gleamed unnaturally bright. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't stop myself from reaching out. As my hand touched the handle, the radio on my belt crackled. A voice I didn't recognize spoke, low and distorted. "Turn back." I froze, my hand trembling. The voice was calm, almost gentle, but the weight behind it was undeniable. I glanced back down the hallway, half expecting the rule enforcer to appear. But the hallway was empty. Ignoring the warning, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond the door was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was circular, with walls that seemed to stretch infinitely upward, disappearing into darkness. The floor was covered in a mosaic of the same glowing symbols, their light shifting and swirling beneath my feet. In the center of the room stood a pedestal. On it rested an object, a black cube small enough to fit in my hand. It seemed to absorb the light around it, casting no reflection, no shadow. I stepped closer, drawn to the cube by an irresistible pull. My hand reached out before I could stop it, fingers brushing against the cool surface. The moment I touched it, the world shifted. A flood of images filled my mind, too fast to process. I saw the facility as it once was, bright, bustling with workers in white coats. I saw experiments, machines humming with unnatural energy, and people breaking rules that hadn't yet been written. Then came the entities, shadows slipping through cracks in reality, their forms twisting and impossible to comprehend. They moved through the facility, consuming and corrupting everything in their path. The rules were born out of desperation, each one a barrier against the chaos. Finally, I saw the rule enforcer. It wasn't an entity, but something created to maintain the fragile order. A guardian, bound to the facility and its rules. The visions ended abruptly, leaving me gasping for breath. My head throbbed as I stumbled back, the cube slipping from my hand. It hit the floor with a soundless thud, the light in the room dimming as it came to rest. I barely had time to react before the room plunged into darkness. The air grew heavy, pressing against my chest, and a familiar hum filled my ears. When the lights returned, the rule enforcer was standing before me. Its elongated form was even more unsettling up close, its featureless face angled down as if studying me. I felt its presence like a physical weight, pinning me in place. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then the radio crackled to life. "Leave. Now." I didn't hesitate. I bolted back down the hallway, my heart pounding as the glow of the carvings faded behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the security room, slamming the door shut and collapsing into the chair. When Marlene arrived at the end of my shift, she didn't ask any questions. She simply looked at me, her expression a mix of frustration and pity. "You went too far," she said quietly. "Didn't you?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. The images from the cube were burned into my mind, and I knew I'd never see this place the same way again. Marlene sighed, shaking her head. "You've seen things you shouldn't have, and now, it's only a matter of time." The visions from the cube lingered, haunting me long after my shift ended. I barely slept that day, the images of the rule enforcer, the entities, and the symbols flashing behind my closed eyelids. Every time I woke, drenched in sweat, the same thoughts circled my mind. I have to leave this place. But leaving wasn't that simple. Marlene's words echoed in my head. "It's like this place keeps you." There was truth in that. Despite everything, I felt tethered to the facility, as though an invisible thread was holding me there. Still, I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was happening in that building, I was in over my head, and I was running out of time. I arrived for my 7th shift with a plan. Finish the night, follow the rules as closely as possible, and walk out without looking back. No curiosity, no deviations, just survival. Marlene was waiting for me in the security room when I got there. She didn't speak at first, just watched as I settled into my chair. Her expression was hard to read. Part suspicion, part regret. "You're thinking about leaving," she said finally. I froze. "How do you know that?" She shrugged. "I've seen it before. You're not the first one who thought they could just walk away. But I'm telling you, it's not that simple." I stared at her, my pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward, her voice low. "This place doesn't let go easily. People who leave, they don't stay gone. Pulls them back. Or worse." "Worse," I echoed, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she stood and headed for the door. "If you're really going to try, just remember the rules, especially Rule 7. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The first half of the night was quiet, almost unnervingly so. I stuck to the rules with religious precision, refusing to take my eyes off the monitors or deviate from my routine. But as 2 a.m. approached, a sound broke the stillness. The emergency alarm. It started as a low, droning hum, quickly escalating into a deafening wail. The monitors flickered, showing distorted images of the hallways, warped and twisting as though the building itself was alive. Red arrows lit up on the floor, pointing toward the safe room. Rule 5 echoed in my mind. If you hear the emergency alarm, follow the red arrows. Do not stop until you reach the safe room. I grabbed my flashlight and ran, my heart pounding as the arrows guided me through the labyrinthine corridors. The walls seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavier with every step. I could hear something behind me, footsteps, or maybe just the echoes of my own, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the safe room, I slammed the door shut and collapsed against it, gasping for breath. The room was small and featureless, with nothing but a single chair in the center. The alarms outside faded, replaced by an eerie silence. I sat in the chair, my mind racing. Something was changing. The facility was growing more hostile, as if it knew I wanted to leave. When the alarms finally ended and the red arrows disappeared, I made my way back to the security room, trying to calm my nerves. The rest of the shift was a blur of paranoia and second-guessing. I kept waiting for something else to happen. A knock at the door, a shadow on the monitors, but nothing came. When the clock struck 8 a.m., I stood up, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the exit. My pulse quickened as I reached the front doors, my hand hovering over the handle. Rule 7. At the end of your shift, exit the building immediately. Do not speak to anyone on your way out. As I pushed the door open, I heard a voice behind me. Jake! I froze. It was Alex's voice, calm and casual, like he was trying to get my attention. You forgot something. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to follow the rule. But my body felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, I turned. Alex was standing at the end of the hallway, his figure partially obscured by shadows. His face was pale, his features almost plastic-like, as if he wasn't entirely real. You're making a mistake, he said, his tone unervingly even. You can't leave. My grip on the door tightened. Why not? His head tilted slightly, his eyes unblinking. Because you belong here. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back to the door and stepped outside without another word, the morning sunlight blinding me as I walked to my car. I didn't go back the next night, or the night after that. I ignored the calls from the facility, deleted the voicemails without listening. For the first time in weeks, I felt free, no rules, no shadows, no whispered warnings. But the freedom didn't last. Started small. Objects in my apartment weren't where I'd left them. My reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed off, like it was a fraction of a second out of sync. At night, I heard faint tapping at my windows, even though I lived on the 3rd floor. Then, a week after I left the job, I woke up to find a new rule sheet on my kitchen table. It was identical to the ones I'd been given at the facility, except for one addition at the bottom. 9. You can never truly leave. I stared at the rule sheet on my kitchen table, my hands trembling as I read the words over and over. 9. You can never truly leave. The paper looked identical to the ones from the facility, down to the faint crease marks and smudges of ink. But I hadn't brought this one home. Someone or something had placed it there. For a week, I tried to put the facility behind me, to pretend that my time there was just a strange, unsettling chapter in my life. But now it was clear. The building wasn't done with me. That night, I dreamed of the rule enforcer. Its featureless face loomed over me, its voice echoing in my mind. Come back. It's time. The next day, the phone rang. I let it go to voicemail just like I had every other time the facility called. But this time, the voicemail wasn't the usual automated message. It was Marlene. Jake, I know you're scared, she said, her voice tense and hurried. But you need to come back. Tonight. If you don't... She paused, and for the first time, I heard something in her voice I hadn't expected. Fear. Just come back. Trust me. The line went dead. For hours, I debated what to do. Every logical part of me screamed to stay away, to ignore the pull of the facility. But deep down, I knew I didn't have a choice. Rule 9 had already taken hold, and the longer I resisted, the worse it would get. By 7:30 p.m., I was back in my car, driving toward the facility. When I arrived, the building looked the same as always. Cold, silent, unassuming. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt the difference. The air was heavier, the shadows darker. The faint hum I'd noticed before had grown louder, almost deafening, and the walls seemed to pulse, as if the building itself was alive. The security room was empty when I got there. No Marlene, no Alex, no sign of the laminated rule sheet. Only the monitors were on, their screens flickering with static. As I sat down, the radio on the desk crackled to life. "Welcome back." The voice was distorted, but I recognized it immediately. The rule enforcer. The night started with an eerie calm. The monitors flickered between empty hallways, but every so often, I caught glimpses of something. A shadow sliding across the floor, a faint glow in one of the storage rooms. I followed the rules religiously, too afraid to deviate after what had happened before. But at exactly midnight, the alarms went off. Red arrows lit up on the floor, guiding me toward the safe room. Rule 5. Follow the red arrows. Do not stop until you reach the safe room. I grabbed my flashlight and ran, my footsteps echoing through the hallways. But as I turned a corner, I saw something that made me stop. Marlene. She was standing in the middle of the hallway, her back to me. Her posture was stiff, unnatural, and her head tilted slightly, as though she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Marlene," I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't respond. Instead, she turned slowly to face me, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her face was wrong. Her features distorted, as if someone had tried to recreate her from memory and failed. "You broke the rules," she said, her voice layered with an unnatural static. I stumbled back, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The arrows on the floor pulsed urgently, but I couldn't move. Marlene, or whatever was pretending to be her, took a step toward me. "You don't belong here," she said, "but you can't leave either." I turned and ran, abandoning the safe room and the red arrows. Behind me, I could hear the sound of footsteps, too many to belong to one person, chasing me through the maze-like hallways. Somehow, I ended up back at the unmarked hallway from my earlier exploration. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter than ever, casting eerie patterns of light and shadow. At the end of the hallway, the wooden door stood open, the black cube waiting on the pedestal inside. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind me, and the humming sound rose to a deafening pitch. The symbols on the floor shifted and swirled, pulling me toward the pedestal. The cube seemed to call to me, its surface pulsing with an otherworldly energy. I reached out, my fingers brushing against it once more. The visions returned, but this time they were clearer. I saw the facility as it truly was, a fractured point in reality, a place where the rules kept the chaos at bay. The rule enforcer wasn't a guardian. It was a jailer, keeping the entities trapped within the building. And now I realized I was part of the system. The voice of the rule enforcer filled the room, low and reverberating. "You have a choice. Stay and enforce the rules. Or leave and take the chaos with you." The symbols on the floor flared, the light blinding. My mind raced. If I stayed, I would become part of the facility, bound to its rules forever. But if I left, I would risk unleashing whatever horrors the rules contained. The door behind me creaked open, revealing the shadowy figure of the rule enforcer. Tilted its head, waiting. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen between the two choices. But eventually I made my decision. I took the cube and placed it back on the pedestal. The humming stopped, the symbols dimmed, and the rule enforcer stepped aside, allowing me to leave the room. As I walked back through the hallways, the building felt different, quieter, less oppressive. I made my way to the exit, my heart pounding as I pushed open the doors and stepped into the morning light. It's been weeks since that night, and the facility hasn't contacted me again. The nightmares have stopped, and the tapping at my windows has ceased. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, I feel a faint pull, like a thread tugging at the edges of my mind. I know the facility isn't done with me. The rules may have let me go for now, but I'll never truly be free. And as much as I hate to admit it, part of me misses the order the rules provided, the strange, fragile sense of control in a world teetering on the edge of chaos. Because now, without them, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching, waiting, and one day I know it will call me back. Weeks turned into months, and the memory of the facility began to blur at the edges. The vivid terror of those nights dulled into a haze of surreal, disjointed fragments. I tried to rebuild my life, find work that didn't involve shadowy hallways or cryptic rules. But no matter how far I tried to push it down, the truth clawed its way back into my thoughts. I hadn't left. Not really. The first sign came on an otherwise ordinary day. I was walking home from a grocery run when I noticed a shadow in the corner of my vision. It was subtle at first, slipping behind a car or blending into a passing group of people. But as I turned down my street, the shadow lingered, standing at the end of the block, tall, elongated, watching. By the time I blinked, it was gone. The rule sheet appeared again 2 weeks later, taped to my bathroom mirror. It was identical to the others except for one change. Rule 9 was now Rule 1. The other rules had shifted, reordered as if mocking my attempt to leave it all behind. At the bottom, in bold, were the words, "Your shift begins at 8 p.m., don't be late." I tore the sheet down, shredded it, and flushed the pieces down the toilet. But the next morning, it was back, pristine and laminated, sitting on my nightstand. I didn't go back to the facility. Not yet. But the rules began to bleed into my life in ways I couldn't ignore. Lights in my apartment would flicker at 3:33 a.m., knocking sounds echoed from inside my locked pantry. Strangers in the street looked at me with a knowing intensity, as though they recognized something hidden in me. The worst was the mirrors. My reflection stopped matching my movements, lagging behind like it was considering something else before following suit. I stopped looking directly at it, stopped trusting it. I considered telling someone, friends, family, even a therapist. But how do you explain something like this? That you worked in a place where rules protected you from entities that weren't supposed to exist? That the job never really ended, and now your life was governed by a shadowy, unseen force? I tried once, though, with an old college friend. We met for coffee, and after an hour of small talk, I told him everything. To his credit, he didn't laugh. He just sat there, nodding, his face neutral. When I finished, he leaned forward and said, "Jake, I think you need help. Serious help. This sounds like paranoia, maybe trauma from the job." I nodded, pretending to agree. But as we parted ways, I noticed something. The shadow I'd seen watching me before was now following him. He called me a few days later, frantic, claiming his apartment lights wouldn't stop flickering at night. I hung up before he could say more. I couldn't bring anyone else into this. 3 months after I left the facility, the nightmares came back. The rule enforcer, the entities, the glowing symbols, they invaded my sleep, more vivid than ever. One dream was different, though. In it, I was back in the unmarked hallway, standing before the wooden door. This time, the cube wasn't on the pedestal. The room was empty, and a voice whispered from the darkness, "It's loose." I woke drenched in sweat, my pulse racing. I knew what it meant. Something had escaped the facility that night, and the rules weren't just keeping me in line. They were keeping everything else contained. The next morning, the rule sheet was taped to my front door. I didn't bother tearing it down. Instead, I packed a bag, got in my car, and drove back to the facility. The building was the same as always. Cold, silent, and unwelcoming. But as I stepped inside, I noticed subtle differences. The hum in the walls was louder, almost urgent, and the air felt thicker, like the building was holding its breath. The security room was dark when I entered. The monitors were off, the desk cleared of papers. For a moment, I thought I was alone. Then Marlene stepped out of the shadows. You came back, she said, her tone a mix of relief and disappointment. I wasn't sure you would. I didn't have a choice, I said, holding up the rule sheet. You knew this would happen, didn't you? She nodded. No one really leaves. Not for long. Marlene handed me a new rule sheet. This one was shorter than the others, with only one rule written in bold at the top. Restore the balance. What does it mean? I asked. She hesitated, then said, the rules are breaking. Something's loose, and if we don't fix it, the building won't hold. Fix what? I pressed. What's loose? She didn't answer. Instead, she gestured to the hallway, where the glow of the carvings had returned, brighter and more chaotic than before. You'll know when you see it, she said, but be careful. The enforcer can't protect you this time. I followed the carvings back to the unmarked hallway, the hum growing louder with every step. The wooden door was open, but the room beyond was different now. The symbols on the floor pulsed erratically, their light flickering as if struggling to stay lit. In the center of the room was the black cube, but it wasn't inert this time. It floated above the pedestal, spinning slowly, its surface rippling like liquid. As I stepped closer, the air around it warped, distorting the space like a heat mirage. Shadows moved within the distortion, shapes too abstract to comprehend. The rule enforcer appeared, stepping out of the shadows. It didn't speak this time, but its presence was oppressive, a reminder of the balance it was trying to maintain. It gestured toward the cube, its elongated arm moving with deliberate intent. I reached out, my hand trembling, and placed it on the cube. A searing pain shot through me as the symbols on the floor flared to life, the room flooding with light. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the security room. The monitors were on again, showing the familiar empty hallways. The hum was gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Marlene was standing by the door, watching me with an expression I couldn't place. It's done, she said. What's done? I asked, my voice hoarse. The balance, she said simply. For now. I left the facility for the last time that morning. No rule sheet followed me home, and for the first time in months, I felt a strange, hollow peace. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The balance might have been restored, but the rules were still out there, waiting. And one day, I know they'll call me back.